In my last video, I mentioned that it's been 5 years, or even maybe more than that, since I've last used a stitch dictionary to help me come up with a pattern for stranded colorwork. Ever since then, I've been working 100% with my own designs. And while I'm by no means prolific enough to be writing my own stitch dictionary, I truly believe that this is something that anybody can do with a little bit of practice and a little bit of patience, and it's really fun to come up with your own stitch pattern. All you really need to do this is some yarn, some needles, and your imagination, but I do find that a marker and some graph paper can really help you chart out your designs, come up with something new, play around, so that you're spending a little bit less time swatching and making mistakes and more time coming up with fun designs. If you're brand new to stranded colorwork, I do recommend that you start working with somebody else's designs first. That will let you get an understanding of how stranded colorwork works, how it behaves, how you interact with it, and what you like and dislike about it. That way you can kind of adapt your own designs to suit yourself. So this is an example of a sweater that I made with someone else's design. It's just a pretty standard sweater. This was pretty early in my knitting design journey. So I took the top half of one sweater and put it on the bottom half of another sweater. Both of them are somebody else's designs, but it was just a really fun way to get acquainted with stranded colorwork. Once you've got the feel of stranded colorwork and you're ready to kind of branch out and do a little bit more, the next thing that I did was I started stacking patterns on top of each other. So what this looked like was looking through some of my stitch dictionaries, finding patterns that I liked, and then arranging them together in a way that I thought was really interesting and attractive. So that's what I did with this sweater. Most of these designs that are on this sweater come from 2 or 3 different stitch dictionaries. So, the only thing that's original about them is the way that I combined them and the way that I applied the colors. There's still quite a lot of work that went into that, but I was at this point using other people's stitch patterns. Now, when you start doing this, you may find that you need to scale up a pattern or scale down a pattern to fit with your other patterns. And that's a really essential skill to kind of work with. And I typically do that on graph paper and see how everything plays together. Another thing that you will find yourself needing to do is centering and moving the patterns around. This is a really essential skill for stranded colorwork. So for example, at the back, I have these little arrows that go around the bands around this big motif, and starting at the center back, they shift directions. I need to know where the center back is so I can find that in my chart and make sure to place that appropriately. So that is something that you will find yourself doing when you start stacking designs on top of each other, and that's a really important skill to have, and it's really kind of like the first step in that design process. Once you start to get more and more confident with your stranded colorwork, you are going to start to see designs and patterns everywhere you look. This is a great opportunity to start deconstructing some of the patterns that you see on other knitted garments. Try looking at them and seeing if you can chart them out, and seeing if you can knit a swatch that's just based on what you observed from somebody else's stranded colorwork design. Now, do remember at this point, this is a learning exercise, so you shouldn't be trying to pass this design off as your own. It is very much a step of copying that is meant to be a learning process. So you shouldn't be profiting off of it. You shouldn't be selling this design. It's somebody else's design that you're learning from. So that's what I did with this sweater here. So I saw a stitch pattern that I liked. I liked the way it blended in with the stitches around it, and I made a whole sweater that was deconstructed that one stitch pattern that I saw on a pair of mittens. Now it's time to start designing in earnest, and there are a couple of things that you really need to know when you start making your own designs. The first thing is that knit stitches aren't actually square. They're slightly rectangular. You might already know this if you are accustomed to picking up stitches to knit on a button band or a neckband or something like that, where you might be picking up according to a specific ratio rather than 1 for 1. That's because knit stitches are not square, they're slightly rectangular. Now you can buy special knitter's graph paper, and I'll link to that below, but there's another trick that I use with square graph paper, and it means I don't have to be buying anything extra special. This is just a plain old pad of regular graph paper that I work with all the time. And it's got an added bonus that it's quicker. So all you have to do is make little dots in your squares of your design. That's all there is to it. And I have found that if they read well as a design in the dot form, then they're going to read well as a knit design in Stranded Colorwork. So this is something that's super fast and easy. It uses things that I already have on hand, and I highly recommend it. Then the added bonus is that you can fill in your colors behind that. You can kind of play around with that, but you'll always be able to see easily at a glance what's your pattern color and what's your background color. If you're hoping to get something really graphic, like a perfect diamond or a perfect circle, you might need to adjust your stitch counts or your row counts, just depending on your gauge, the pattern that you're working with. You're definitely going to want to do some swatching, because remember, it's not a square, it's a rectangle that you're working with. The second thing is all about floats. On the inside of a Stranded Colorwork garment, you're going to have floats. These are the areas where one color wasn't knitting and it travels to the next spot where it does knit. And in Stranded Colorwork, you're just swapping back and forth between colors all the time, and you generate these floats across the back of a garment. Now, there are rules for how to do this. First of all, you want to make sure that you're stretching your knitting across the needles adequately so that you're not bunching them up and making the floats too short. But you also don't want the floats to be too long, and that's really important to think about at the design stage. If a float is too long, you risk getting it caught in your fingers, your jewelry, anything that could catch on it while you're putting the garment on or taking it off. That could snag and lead to problems with the long-term wear and tear of your garment. So you don't want your floats to be too long. How long is too long? Well, that's a matter that's up for debate. The standard is probably somewhere around an inch to an inch and a half if you want to be really daring. And depending on your gauge, this could be anywhere from 5 stitches to 8 or 9 stitches, but it really depends on your gauge. Another issue that might pop up is the way that your colorwork patterns align the stitches and the colors between and among each other. When you have very graphic elements that are very square and stack on top of each other, you need to be really careful with how you're knitting. You don't want to pull too tight or be too loose, because you'll risk distorting the fabric. And this is why you're typically going to see traditional patterns move in diamond shapes, zigzag shapes, X's and O's. It solves the problem of too many elements stacking on top of each other and distorting and buckling the fabric. That doesn't mean that you always have to use that kind of shape, however. It just means that if you stray away from it, you need to be conscious of how you're knitting as you go. So you're going to take your inspiration and you're going to translate that into a chart. And you're going to play around with this for as long as it takes until you have a design that you think is going to knit up nicely. If you're struggling at this point to come up with designs or how do you translate something into a grid, take a look at your stitch dictionaries and see how they do it and sort of pull some inspiration from that. Or I'd highly recommend Felicity Ford's Stranded Colorwork Sourcebook. It talks about how she'll take her inspiration and translate it into a chart, how she'll choose colors, ways that you can kind of speed up the swatching process. It's a really helpful resource. I highly recommend it, and I'll link to it below. I would also recommend Janine Bages's The Joy of Color. It has a lot of the same themes, and it's slightly more available in the United States if you're looking for something fast. It really focuses more on stories of individual designers and how they came up with their design. So if that's how you learn, this might be more helpful. And it also introduces the concept of the speed swatch, which doesn't use your pattern so much as help you decide on your colors. And that can be really helpful if color is something that's a struggle for you. And I'll link to this one as well. Whatever you end up with, your design is going to show up the best if you have a strong value contrast between your two colors that you're using in any given row. Value contrast is just light and dark. So one is significantly lighter and the other is significantly darker. If you're struggling because the colors are making it hard for you to be able to tell, I'd highly recommend using your cell phone or other camera with a black and white filter on it. Once it's in black and white, you can easily see one is lighter than the other and one is darker. If they're kind of close and it's hard to tell the difference, you're not going to get as strong of effect in your stranded color work. You might like that subtle effect, or you might want to go for that clear, bright contrast. Don't be afraid to play around with scale and the repeats of your pattern. Sometimes what you start out with is maybe a little bit too complex, especially if you're knitting at a looser gauge. So for example, on this sweater, my original idea was to have oyster shells followed by a conch and then like a clamshell at the top. And once I swatched it out, I realized that what I wanted to do was repeat the pattern twice, so I would reflect it up. I didn't think I was going to have enough yarn to do it that way, and I really wanted this sweater with the pattern just at the bottom. What I did instead was I took the oyster motif and I flipped it and shifted it to the side, and that resulted in what I think is a really attractive pattern and more readable than my original design. With this sweater, I'm playing with scale in a different way. I am playing with the scale all the way around the circumference of the garment. The scales start out very small on the side panels. They become a little bit bigger as we come in towards the center, and bigger, and then in the very center I'm going up and down with scales depending on the section of the motif. So I'm playing with that as I knit the sweater. The sweater that I'm wearing is based on a snake skin, so like the back of a snake. The way that I came up with this pattern is I referenced lots of different snakes. I looked up pictures on the internet and looked at the patterns that their bodies formed across their backs, and then I charted that out, and I charted maybe 20 or 30 different patterns before I came up with one that I thought was, one, interesting, and two, something that I would enjoy knitting. As always, make sure that you make a swatch before you dive into a huge project. That way you won't have any difficult surprises later on. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Do you have some way that you design a stitch pattern that really works for you? I'd love to hear about it. Or if you have questions about designing your own stitch patterns, let me know in the comments as well. I'd be happy to answer them. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.